Welcome to Newcastle Family History Society podcasts. The Newcastle Family History Society, located on Awabakal land in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, provides support for those interested in family history. We're pleased to bring you a new series presented by Benita Parker from the West Wallsend District Heritage Group. Through first-person storytelling, this series shares the lives of the pioneering women of West Wallsend. Today, we hear the remarkable story of Mary Johnston. Born in a small village in Somerset, England, in 1846, Mary could never have imagined the life before her. A journey across the world, a childhood in the coalfields near Newcastle, and a lifetime of resilience on the rugged frontier of West Wallsend. Through hardship, love, loss and determination, her story brings to life the challenges and triumphs of early settlement in colonial New South Wales. This is more than history, it's a life remembered.
My name is Mary, and I lived for over 50 years in and around West Wallsend. I would like to share my life's journey with you. When I was born in March 1846 in the small village of Hambridge, Somerset, in England, to Charles and Betsy Mounter, no one would have guessed the life I was to live. I was their third child. I had one sister, Sarah, born in 1840, and one brother, Paul, born in 1842. For that time, we were considered a small family, but on reflection, I think my mother had great difficulty falling pregnant and carrying a child to full term. So she was always very protective of the three of us. The decision to leave our village in Hambridge, where my father had been, sometime labourer, sometime miner, and travel around the world, must have been a momentous one for them. I often wondered, later in life, what had attracted them to move thousands of miles to the new colony of New South Wales. I think now it must have been the advertisements in Somerset encouraging young families to come to Newcastle, where there was a permanent job and a home provided in exchange for work in the coal industry. So I came to Australia as a 3-year-old with my family. We arrived on the 4th of September 1849 aboard the Victoria. This ship was a very good ship compared to some of the others sailing between England and Australia. There were hardly any casualties on the entire voyage, according to the records. The Mounter family, all 5 of us, got off the boat at Hexham near Newcastle and lived there for a short time before moving to Wallsend to be closer to my father, Charles' work in the mines. He and so many of the other men who lived around Wallsend walked into Newcastle to the mines at either Lambton or Hamilton each day that the mines were operating. The reason we moved to Wallsend soon after arriving at Hexham was because my mother couldn't tolerate the mosquitoes and swampy conditions. We lived at Wallsend in a cottage that Mum and Dad made into a home for us for the next 10 years. In that time, Sarah got married on Christmas Eve in 1859 to a nice young man who also worked in the mines. His name was Mr. Charles Scotton. Sadly, he died from a mining accident in 1862, only a couple of years after they were married, and Sarah had 2 little boys, Mark and Levi, to care for. She was lucky to find another good man whose name was Francis Buxton, whom she married in 1864. They had 8 more children, but 4 of her children died when they were tiny. She and Francis had a hard life where they lived in Raymond Terrace. Paul married a girl from Minmi named Sarah Watson in 1866, and he firstly became a fisherman around Hexham. They came down to Newcastle to live about 1880. They had a big family of 10 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. In Newcastle, they lived in Mounter Street. Yes, Mounter Street, it may even have been named after my brother, I'm not sure, in Waratah, where Paul set up a general store. We didn't see much of him or his family as we were all very busy. He was really a well-respected man in Newcastle. He died in 1915, only a couple of years before me. As I remember it, I didn't go to school, so Mum taught me everything she could, such as cooking and sewing, my letters and numbers, as well as lots of lovely songs and silly ditties. Both Mum and Dad had some schooling back in Somerset, as there was a village school that they attended when they could. The biggest trauma in my life at that time was when I turned 14. My father gave me the biggest hug and said that his little girl had gone now, and I was old enough to go to work. I didn't want to go to work as I loved being home with Mum. But in those days, everyone had to work and contribute to the family income. The very next morning, I had to get up early and put on my best skirt and blouse and a new pair of boots bought especially for the occasion. After a quick breakfast, Dad, Paul and I set off to walk into Newcastle. It was a long walk for me, especially in my nice new boots, which soon hurt my feet. The road was dusty and dirty, and even though I had polished my boots until they shone, by the time we got into town they were dull and horrible. So when we got close to the hotel, I tried to scrub them clean with one of my under-petticoats until they looked a little better. Paul went to work, but Dad took me to a very large and imposing hotel near where he worked. We were met by the hotel owner, who had told Dad he was looking for a good, clean, hard-working lass to become a maid in the hotel. After much assurance from my dad as to my talents, the owner said he would take me on as a chambermaid. Now, I didn't know what a chambermaid was, but I soon found out. She was the person who emptied all the used chamber pots full of urine and such every morning. Then she washed them and returned them to be placed under the bed in the guest rooms. After that, each room had to be cleaned and the beds made. Yes, it was hard work. At first I was supervised by a senior maid, but I was a quick learner, and before the year had passed, I had become the senior maid myself. We maids lived in a crowded room upstairs at the back of the hotel and were allowed to go home one day a week if there was not some other job that needed our attention. Actually, that's how I met an interesting Scotsman who visited the hotel. One day he said to me, "Mary, if you're not too busy, please come and sit with me to chat." I really was in a dither, as I wasn't sure whether I should talk to the guests or just keep my head down and work. Curiosity won, and we sat under the shade of a big old tree in the backyard. He was a very interesting man with his lovely lilting Scottish accent and a cheerful, happy face. This became a regular occurrence, and one day his name was William, asked me if he could meet my father. I smiled and thought Dad would enjoy talking to this friendly Scotsman, so next time I was home I mentioned it to Dad. He was equally as curious to know why a Scotsman named William wanted to meet him. Anyway, it was all arranged, and I was even allowed to stay with them where they talked in the parlour. After a while, I could see William was a bit nervous and obviously wanted to say something. All of a rush, he said, "Mr. Mounter, I want permission to marry your daughter." Well, I'm not sure who was most surprised, me or my father, but he quickly recovered and it was all arranged. I was to marry William Johnston, aged 36, from Scotland. I was just 17 when I married him in the Presbyterian minister's house in Newcastle on the 2nd of May, 1863. It wasn't a big wedding, but Mum and Dad, Paul and Sarah and some of my work friends were there, and I wore a lovely hat and dress that Mother and I had made for this special event in my life. After our wedding, William had been very fortunate to be able to buy a horse and cart from a man who was leaving the district. So we climbed aboard and headed out to Wallsend to stay with Mum and Dad that night. William said he had a surprise for me, as he had bought a block of land, about 30 acres, out towards the mountains at a place called Apple Tree Flat, and we were going to live out there. He had been working extra hard to build our first home for us to move into, and he was really excited about our adventure together. Next morning we set off, laden with all manner of things, including spades and axes, crosscut saws, seeds and plants, as well as food, flour, tea, sugar, and a few other essentials, and my trousseau box, which contained all the clothes and linen Mum and I had made over the years. What a great adventure it was, sitting up in the cart as I waved goodbye to my parents. William and I were on our own to begin our new life together. At first, the road was in good repair, where it ran past the new mines at Wallsend. They were called A, B and C. C was the newest and most distant from Wallsend, only recently opened up, and by the time we got there, the road was little more than a track. It got worse the further we went, and soon I was saying to William, Is it much further? It took us all day, going up and down over ridges and through creeks, where my lovely new clothes got wet and dirty, and I got a bit tired and grumpy. The bush had been cleared in most places, certainly, but stumps stood out like islands in a sea of dried mud, and ruts 2 and 3 foot deep alternated with waterholes, just waiting to demolish a luckless buggy wheel. Thankfully, our cart was sturdy and survived, as did we. The bullock wagon traffic on this track, west towards the mountains, had converted it almost into a ploughed paddock, where we passed teams of patient struggling oxen, driven by teamsters, who whipped their beasts and shouted obscenities at the poor things. I had never heard or seen such language. Our cart, horse and driver, was just one of many. Here a dreadful accident might easily have occurred if the horse had been nervous or the driver flurried, but William was strong and knew what he was doing. Eventually I cried again, "Are we there yet?" And William gave me a frown, then a smile, and said, "Close your eyes, we're nearly there." After another few minutes of bumping and swaying, William stopped and told me to open my eyes. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, because there in front of me was the tiniest little shack imaginable. This was my new home, our castle, he called it. William couldn't wait to lift me down off the cart and show me our wonderful new world. He had erected the hut of timber and bark, a queer, one-storied little house built of slabs which shrunk apart as time passed and the timber dried, so that there were gaps everywhere, which let the weather, whatever it was, into the house. Of windows there were none, that is to say, in the sense of panes of glass. There were a couple of wooden shutters that we could close at night to keep out the nightlife, mosquitoes, flies, moths, and other bugs. It had a sloping roof of bark and a narrow, roughly boarded veranda. The floors were dirt. Eventually, after a couple of years, we got the main room boarded, which helped with the children when they came along. The rooms had no ceilings, and I have a vivid recollection of weird-looking little lizards and big fat spiders that seemed to live beneath the rafters. Married life was turning out to be something very different from what I had dreamed of. As it turned out, our block was only about 5 or 6 miles from Wallsend in a southwesterly direction, but it seemed a lot further when you had to plough through the bush on bullocky tracks to get there. When you did, there were a number of other free settlers settled down nearby too. But everyone was busy with their own life, so we didn't meet them very often. They were mostly miners like my William, working at the neighbouring collieries or cultivating their farms and orchards. Many of them kept a few cattle and supplied butter and milk to the mining townships around about, while we women raised large families and tended the house and gardens. Most of our possessions consisted of an axe, a spade, and a cross-cut saw for the trees that William had ring-barked and felled on the site of our future homestead. It wasn't very long before I had learnt to wield an axe or grab my end of a cross-cut saw to help clear our block. I quickly learnt that if I didn't chop the wood and kindling, light the fire and cook our tea, we didn't eat. The same applied for doing the washing and keeping our little home clean and tidy. I learnt the hard way and quickly. At first our place was furnished with a trestle bed, which William had made, and blankets, a homemade table and bench, a few cooking utensils I brought from home, and a supply of flour, tea and sugar. Later, we added outbuildings and extended the house as the children arrived. One of our first big tasks was to build a kitchen behind the house, connected to the sitting room by a covered passage. It was separate from the house in case a log rolled out of the fire and burnt the building down. This did occasionally happen to some folk, like poor Elizabeth Nelson. She was cooking tea for her family when a log rolled out of the fire and her dress caught alight. She suffered terrible burns and died a few hours later. Over those early years, other accidents that I recall included a man drowning in Cockle Creek, a miner returning home to his family who died of exposure between Minmai and Taralba, a horse-riding death of an important local man, snakebite of a 7-year-old boy, and the drowning of a little girl in a water tank. Life could be hard in the bush, and I was always thankful when it didn't visit us with a sad loss. Ah, the joys of country life. Then there was our garden, fenced in with bush palings, which we made, over which our tame kangaroo tried to take his daily constitutional. He was only one among many native animals that would invade our garden whenever the opportunity presented itself. Here we tried to grow our vegetables, fruit and grapes, and anything that could provide our daily needs. There were times when the drays bringing our additional supplies were delayed by flooded creeks, boggy roads, or bushfires. When our supply was empty of flour, tea, sugar, and all other groceries, it was sometimes a real case of going to bed hungry for lack of food. There were other problems too. The huge Wallsend Coal Company had, by this time in the late 1860s, bought up and owned a lot of land where we were settled, and we and other small settlers were subject to the annoyance of having our cattle impounded off the unfenced land of the Wallsend Coal Company. We were all at our wits' end to know how we should go about making the company fence off their land. Some of the men thought that perhaps if the company were appealed to in Sydney, they might be induced to offer some relief, but to no avail. It seemed scarcely possible that such a large and wealthy company, owning one of the finest estates in the district, could have any desire to ruin a few poor free settlers like us. But that seemed to be what was happening. It was a case of settler, look after thyself. In the early days of our settling, we, Mr. and Mrs. William Johnston, were frequently visited, not by important visitors, but by Aboriginals who always stayed hidden in the bush. The only other regular visitor was a Chinese hawker who used to come from Sydney occasionally to peddle his wares. There were still 1 or 2 Chinese market gardeners across the creek on the good flat soil and near the water of Cockle Creek, but they weren't hawkers. There was so much wildlife in the bush around us that catching a bush turkey or wallaby wasn't too difficult. Dingoes were plentiful in those days too, so we had to make sure our chooks were well locked up at night. Wild horses were also numerous around about and could trample your garden fences and ruin the garden if not hunted away. Life was never dull. A stream known as Flaggy Creek, people later called it Slaty Creek, flowed into Cockle Creek near our block. In those early days it was teeming with fish. Many a feed of fresh fish we had years later when the boys were old enough to go fishing and trapping. But the stream that ran by our place was called Sandy Creek, and not really deep enough to have fish. It was normally only small, except in heavy rain when floodwaters came raging down from the mountains. Then it could cause problems. Let me go back to those early days when we first were married. I tried never to cry when William was home, but when he went to work at the mine each day and I was left by myself, yes, I did cry, a lot. Then one day, after I'd been feeling unwell for a few mornings, I began to wonder if I was going to have a baby. When I told William, he picked me up and whirled me around, hugging me and kissing me. I worried about how I would give birth to a child without my mother, or anyone else for that matter. But William happily informed me that there were women settlers around the neighbourhood who he could call on to help me, and that's what happened. James was born the year after we were married. He was a big, strong baby and never gave us any trouble. 2 years later, Charles arrived, and although he wasn't as big and strong as James, he followed James wherever he went, and I never had a moment's worry about the boys when they went out to play. Then, 2 years later, Lucy arrived. She was a sad little bundle, and I remember the midwife saying that she would be lucky to survive. I looked after her and cared for her, but she never thrived, and about 12 months after Margaret was born, poor little Lucy got a fever and passed away. I sat with her in my arms until William came home. He knew what to do. He took the 2 boys and they made a little coffin for Lucy, and then dug a grave out near a huge boulder on the back of the property. We buried her there, and William made a beautiful wooden cross and said a little prayer. Maggie and I had gathered some bush flowers to put on the grave before we struggled home with our 3 remaining children. Over the years, I gave birth to another 8 children. Yes, we had 12 children, and apart from baby Lucy, all survived to adulthood. In March 1870, the year before baby Lucy died, there were severe storms and lightning strikes on the property of Mr. Alexander Johnston, who lived nearby but was no relation to us. We were told that mahogany, stringy bark and ironbark trees all attracted lightning, so keep away from them in stormy weather. This was the kind of knowledge you only learnt from the locals. I remember in 1871, when we had Jimmy, Charles, Lucy and Maggie, and I was pregnant with Thomas, a great flood came down from the mountains after torrential rain. It rained until I thought it would never stop, and someone said later it was about 10 inches. It washed half our hard work and gardens away, but nearly wiped out one of our neighbours, Mr. Cherry's beautiful orchard of oranges, apples and pears, away completely. The little building they used as a school disappeared overnight. Then 40 children, including ours, and Mr. Gillespie, their teacher, were without a school building for a couple of years. More work for poor William and the other local men trying to get the government to replace our little school. Eventually they did, but in a different place. This made some people happy, but upset others, as their children had to walk further through the bush each day to school. It was only a few years after that, in about 1875, we were suffering severely from a long drought, and we all said that unless rain soon fell, our orchards and little farms would be thoroughly ruined. By June 1876, it was a bad year for bushfires too. Our little creek, just dried up completely. William had to dig a well, so we had some water. It was during the late 1870s that William received an interesting piece of gossip from his friend, James Fletcher. James and William had come out from Scotland at the same time and worked in the same mine together in Newcastle, and had gone off to the goldfields at Bendigo together, so they were close friends. James, however, had bought a newspaper and became the first mayor of Wallsend, as well as entering New South Wales politics. James suggested that now was a good time to invest in more land just south of where we were living. William was able to claim a large acreage, and lo and behold, within a matter of a year or two, he was approached by Mr. William Laidley. He was a prominent merchant, shipping agent, and colliery proprietor, and a very rich and powerful gentleman. He bought all the land from us. This meant that we could move closer to where the new mine, called West Wallsend, was being developed. We leased land which was far more productive than our own block had been from the O'Donnell family at the foot of Mount Sugarloaf, and our whole family moved. This new wealth also meant that William no longer had to work in the mines, but could turn his attention to a more profitable way of life. I must pause here and hope you will join me next time for the next part of my story.
You've been listening to the life story of Mary Johnston, a true pioneer of the West Wallsend district. From her childhood journey to Australia to the hardships and resilience of building a life in the bush, Mary's story reminds us of the strength and endurance of those who came before us. Join us next time as Mary continues her journey through new challenges, new opportunities, and the ever-changing world of colonial New South Wales. Until then, thank you for listening to Newcastle Family History Society Podcasts.